In this episode, the Enterprise accidentally flings itself centuries into the past, but everybody on board is pretty blasé about it, actually. Because these people are professionals. This is a review of the classic Star Trek episode Tomorrow is Yesterday. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. This is one of the most important episodes of Star Trek because of the concepts it introduces, but is it any good? Let's find out. We open on stock footage. Can't say that about too many Star Trek episodes, can ya? It's a modern-day Air Force base. Well, modern day as of 1967. And radar has picked up a UFO, something really big, coming in really fast. That UFO, the Starship Enterprise. We cut to the bridge where things are a bit chaotic. Captain Kirk is staggering around, helping his crew up off the deck. Injuries are minor, but the ship's warp engines are seriously damaged. What happened, as Kirk's captain's log explains, is the Enterprise was flying along, just minding its own business, when a black star with a high gravitational pull took hold of it and started dragging it in. It took all their warp power to break away, and when they did, the resulting slingshot effect sent them hurling out of control through space, coming to a stop here, wherever here is. Here is Earth, Spock informs Kirk a moment later. Convenient. They were apparently heading this direction anyway. The slingshot effect just got them here a lot faster than planned. But there's a problem. A problem we already know about because we saw the teaser. Uhura can't raise Starfleet on any communications channels, and the radio traffic she can pick up includes a news report about the upcoming first manned moonshot, which Kirk immediately recognizes as taking place in the late 1960s. Uh-oh! Spock, never more his calm, logical self than this moment, dryly concludes that the slingshot effect from the Black Star not only propelled them through space, but also back in time. Can't dwell on that for too long, though, because the Enterprise's current position is actually in Earth's atmosphere, and the Air Force has scrambled a jet to come up and check it out. With its damaged engines, the Enterprise can't climb back up into outer space before the jet catches it. Kirk orders a tractor beam to hold the jet at bay, but the jet is too fragile, and the beam causes it to start breaking up. Not wanting to harm the pilot of the jet, Kirk orders him beamed aboard and heads down to the transporter room to meet him. The jet pilot, Air Force Captain John Christopher, is understandably confused when he finds himself standing on the transporter pad, but Kirk is friendly and reassuring. He apologizes for accidentally destroying Christopher's plane and for bringing him aboard the Enterprise so abruptly. Christopher's like, "Who are you people? What is this place?" Kirk very coyly says, "Oh, we'll tell you what we decide to tell you in due time, Captain Christopher." And then like 30 seconds later in the turbo lift, he's like, "Okay, fine, we're from the future. This is a spaceship. This is a big spaceship from the future. Isn't it cool? You think it's cool, right?" Kirk takes Christopher to the bridge. As they're stepping off the elevator, Christopher says, "I don't believe in little green men." And Spock overhears him and steps forward like, "Little green men is how we refer to ourselves. You don't get to say that." Repairs are proceeding, but Spock pulls Kirk aside to discuss another problem. Now that Captain Christopher is aboard the ship, he can't be allowed to leave. His knowledge of their ship and their future technology could lead to an alteration of the timeline that would wipe out the world they come from. Christopher, who has a wife and children, doesn't really want to spend the rest of his life on a spaceship from the future, so he tries to escape, but gets caught and knocked out by Kirk. While Christopher is recovering in sickbay, Spock walks in like, "Hey, I changed my mind. We definitely have to send him back." Spock has done some research and discovered that Captain Christopher's son, who has not been born as of yet, will grow up to lead the first manned mission to Saturn, which I guess is kind of a big deal. They can't risk such a significant alteration to the timeline, so Christopher has to return to Earth so he can raw dog his wife and make that Saturn baby. Christopher informs Kirk that if they return him, he, as an officer of the Air Force, will be duty-bound to report everything he's seen. And there will be plenty of evidence to back up his story, including the tapes of his radio transmissions after making visual contact with the Enterprise and the photos he took of the ship with his plane's wing cameras, which will be in the wreckage of his plane, which the Air Force will have recovered by now. So Kirk says, okay then, we'll just beam down to the Air Force Base and steal those record tapes and the film from your wing cameras. That way you can run your mouth all day about the spaceship from the future you saw, and everyone will think you're just some goddamn delusional crackpot. Captain Christopher's like, sounds good, let me draw you a floor plan of the base. Kirk and Sulu beam down to the base, and after some sneaking around, find the tapes and the film they're after. They get caught by a guard, but Spock beams that guy up and holds him in the transporter room. Then, while making a final sweep for anything they missed, Kirk gets spotted by some more guards. So Sulu returns to the Enterprise with the stuff, while we enjoy a minute or two of Captain Kirk beating the shit out of some 20th century military guys. We even get to see the rare flying cross-body block. Kirk ain't exactly Ricky Steamboat, but hey, this isn't pro wrestling, this is a real fight. It's 3-on-1, eventually the numbers win out and Kirk is captured. He's interrogated by Colonel Fellini, who is like stealing classified information from a government facility. Who do you think you are, the 45th President of the United States? Fellini tells Kirk, I'm gonna lock you up for 200 years. And Kirk does a Jack Benny take and says, that ought to be just about right. And yeah, at some point after this, the producers decided the show was set in the 23rd century, so locking Kirk up for 200 years starting in the 1960s would actually be about a century short of being just right, but they were making this shit up as they went along, and I think it's a good line. Spock and Sulu, along with Captain Christopher acting as their guide, beam down to the base to rescue Kirk. They knock out Fellini and his guard, but before they can all beam out, Christopher grabs a gun and tries to escape again. So Spock, who has gone into the colonel's office, surreptitiously has himself beamed out and then beamed back in behind Christopher so he can sneak up and neck pinch him. Very clever on the part of Spock and D.C. Fontana, who wrote this episode. They return to the Enterprise and have a meeting, and Spock has an idea. Now that Scotty has repaired the engines, they can recreate the slingshot effect that brought them here in the first place using the sun's gravity. That will allow them to return to their own time. And as a bonus, because of the slingshot effect will cause them to travel further back in time before it throws them forward. If they time everything just right, they can return Captain Christopher and that guard they picked up back to Earth at points before they ever encountered the Enterprise. And as Kirk puts it to Christopher, you won't have anything to remember because it never would have happened. So that's what they do. Christopher is beamed back into himself, I guess, at the moment he first spots the Enterprise, and when he takes a second look, it's gone. The guard is beamed back into himself as he's walking down the hallway, and he enters the room where he caught Kirk and Sulu the first time, and no one's there. The Enterprise flies on. It's a rough ride, but they hit the brakes at just the right moment to wind up back in their own time. Starfleet makes contact, and Kirk confirms the Enterprise is home. Here's what I like about this episode. It's very straightforward. It doesn't get all tangled up in, as you Whovians would say, the timey-wimey stuff. The Enterprise's trip to the past is presented as an accident. Several additional problems result from that accident, and the action of the episode is concerned with the crew of the Enterprise trying to solve those problems. Oops, we went back in time. Better fix the engines and figure out how to get home. Oops, we got spotted by a guy in a jet. Better put a tractor beam on him so he doesn't get too close. Oops, the tractor beam is wrecking his plane. Better beam him aboard so he doesn't die. Oops, now he can't go home because he knows what the future looks like. Oops, he has to go home because his not yet born son is supposed to grow up and become a famous astronaut. Oops, his plane took pictures of us and the military recorded audio transmissions where he describes our ship. Better sneak onto the base and get those suckers. And so on. Shortly after beaming aboard the Enterprise, Kirk explains that their coming to the past was an accident. Christopher replies, "You seem to have a lot of them." Brother, you ain't kidding. That's pretty much all this episode is. Our heroes scrambling to fix a series of accidents. But that's not a knock on the episode. I like that. The plot is fairly basic, but it proceeds logically, with each new development being a consequence of a previous one. Here's what I don't like about this episode. It's very straightforward. There are ways in which that quality works against it. The simple approach keeps the story from tying itself up in knots with time travel paradoxes and existential angst over the dangers of changing the past, but it also leaves the whole thing feeling kind of flat and perfunctory. The Enterprise gets flung back in time. The crew needs to figure out how to get home while leaving behind no evidence of their presence that could change history. They do that, and that's it. There's no commentary on contemporary society, aside from a bit of fun had with the phenomenon of UFO sightings. Kirk and his crew have some fairly extensive interactions with the U.S. military, but the episode offers no criticisms or pointed observations on that subject. The episode has nothing pertinent to say, really. It's not about anything other than its literal plot. It's just a thing that happened and a jam that Kirk and his crew got into and got out of. It doesn't really mean anything. There's also the problem that even if we turn off our brains and just go along with it, never a bad idea when it comes to the technical details of Star Trek episodes, a lot of the time travel stuff just doesn't make sense. Like, if the first slingshot effect sent the Enterprise back in time, why would the second slingshot effect send it forward in time? Spock explains at the end that the increase in speed as they approach the sun would send them back. Then once they break away from the sun's gravity, they'll be thrown forward in time. That doesn't really make sense, but even if we just take it for granted that what Spock says is true, because it's a made-up TV show about future space people, so who cares? Why did it work the opposite way the first time, when the slingshot effect threw them into the past instead of into the future? Even if we accept the whole beaming people back into themselves thing, again, hand-waving is an important skill for enjoying Star Trek, why would Captain Christopher's experience be any different the second time around? After he beams back into his jet, he looks up, and the Enterprise, which was there a moment ago, is suddenly gone. And he doesn't remember ever being on the Enterprise at all. How? Did the memories of his past self overwrite those of the version of him that was on the Enterprise? Why? And why is the Enterprise suddenly not there? Did the Enterprise traveling back in time the second time somehow erase the fact that it did it the first time? That's what we're told happens, but how is that supposed to work? I recognize that these are nitpicks, and normally I don't give too much weight to these sorts of problems, especially in time travel stories where the technical details often don't make any sense because the writers are more concerned with telling a good story than a scientifically plausible one. And, by the way, telling a good story should always take precedence over scientific accuracy. Ideally, you'd find a way to have both. But if you can only have one, choose a good story. Anyway, I think the reason the nitpicky stuff is more apparent in this episode is that it's so straightforward. There's no larger point being made, there's no message, there's no deeper meaning. It's just a simple A to B to C plot-driven episode, which makes the stuff that doesn't make sense stand out more than it otherwise would. The let's just go back in time a little bit further before we go back to the future solution creates another, much more important problem than the illogical timey-wimey stuff. It renders most of the action of the episode pointless. Spock tells Kirk they have to be careful not to allow their presence in the late 60s to change history as they know it. Christopher tells Kirk that there is evidence of his encounter with the Enterprise in the form of recordings of his radio transmissions and photographs from his plane's wing cameras. So Kirk and Sulu go down to the base. That's how Kirk gets caught and interrogated, which in turn is why Spock, Sulu, and Christopher go back to the base. All of that takes up a big chunk of the episode's running time. But then, on their way home, They go back to before any of it happened and drop off Christopher and the other guy, essentially erasing everything they did in the past, meaning that the sneaking around in the base to find the tapes and the photos was pointless. There ultimately was no need to steal the evidence of their visit because by the end of the episode, it was like their visit never happened. Now, Captain Kirk doesn't know any of that when he and Sulu beam down to look for the evidence, so his motivations make sense at the time, but it still winds up being pointless. The characters spend a lot of the episode doing things that seem important when they're doing them, but wind up contributing nothing to the outcome of the story. That's a big problem. However, with all of that being said, Tomorrow Is Yesterday isn't really that bad of an episode. It's not great, despite its eventual importance to the franchise, introducing the slingshot effect that was subsequently used as the basis for the time travel plots of Star Trek IV and the second season of Star Trek Picard, but it's watchable enough. And it has some clever moments. Kirk's fight with the 3 Air Force guys is a lot of fun, as is his interrogation at the hands of Colonel Fellini, and Spock's use of the transporter to sneak up on Captain Christopher from behind is done in a way that respects the intelligence of the audience and allows us to get what has happened on our own instead of smothering it in exposition. And because of the time travel plot and the use of contemporary sets for the scenes that take place in the military base, this is one of the few Star Trek episodes that really feels like a 1960s TV show. Watching it today, I think we often forget that fact because it just reads to our brains as Star Trek. But having so many scenes set in what was then the present day, shot on sets representing contemporary locations, makes the camera work, the editing, the music, the acting style all come through clearly as indicative of their age. Star Trek was ahead of its time in some important ways, but it was also very much a product of its time, especially technically and stylistically. And I enjoy very much how Tomorrow Is Yesterday reminds me of that. Those are my thoughts on Tomorrow Is Yesterday. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Don't forget to join me and my best friend Jason Harding this weekend as we begin our reviews of Season 2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Same deal as with Picard Season 3. We're going to watch the new episodes together and record our review right after. If all goes according to plan, our review of the first episode of Season 2 will be up sometime on Saturday. Really looking forward to that. And please come back next week for another retro review. This batch dedicated to time travel episodes continues with a review of another classic original series episode, perhaps the classic original series episode, The City on the Edge of Forever. I'll see you next week for that. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.